By 2016, the creator of the Indigo reality, the All-Giver, Salem, or the initial entity, had all but turned a blind eye to their unexpectedly persistent pet project. But not because there was something else happening amongst the endless void in which it sat, hunched over, cross-legged, hands across its face. It was simply that, as of say, July 8th, 1979, our initial entity had been trying to reduce its watch time. Too much going on, better things to be doing. Like trashy TV, the Indigo reality would chug along left to its own devices, and so other forces vied for control. Life remained eventful for the denizens of the Indigo reality at all times. From the arid wastes to the grandest concrete jungles, integrity and calamity waged silent war. No, not a war. More like a patient round of chess, fought blindfolded by unassuming participants so assured that they're up to something else entirely that they turn a blind eye to the whispering. None were safe from the wandering hands of the so-called gods, but none were favoured more than Aoife Sheridan, who, on March 5th, felt obliged to answer the door to her own study. You're listening to episode 12 of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, an audiozine presented by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency. The following broadcast is intended for mature audiences only. Despite having occupied the manor known as Strangelove for 190 years, the stained detective had never once been asked to open this door herself. Those who enter Aoife Sheridan's storefront of surreality may feel wonky and wrong. Rarely will the hall allow you to take the same door somewhere twice. A labyrinthian sprawl of unfinished rooms, identical furnishings, and exits to elsewhere. Strangelove was undoubtedly a magical artifact of the grandest nature. Archaic illusions and carbon-dated spackle amongst the irregular architecture inferred a divine designer, specifically Gwalgothrith, the patron saint of lunacy. Knock knock. Wait, knock knock. Disconcerting to say the least. You can't just walk up to Strangelove and let yourself in. You can't actually even approach it, a la Zeno's paradox. As with all magical endeavours, accessing Strangelove carried rules and risks, but to break it down, to enter, one must do so on purpose, through the use of a very specific magic circle. A rite, drawn upon the skin. With this, and provided you've not been barred by the master in advance, any solid wooden door will take you where you wish to be. The foyer, and only the foyer, appears before you. Here, she'll test your mettle. Up until around this time last month, Aoife Sheridan had an assistant, a loyal if not sarcastic lich named Major Tom simply for convenience. If her pet talking skeleton didn't spook you right away, then maybe you've seen something worth talking about. A case for the stained detective. If judged appropriate, the pale PA will unveil the entrance to Aoife's study and even open the door. Unfortunately, this bewitched prat had been looking up his civil rights and insisted on taking at least 28 days vacation in order to find himself. So Aoife was left to deduce the truth of this anxiety-inducing nightmare on her Todd. She couldn't, as it seemed, not from her armchair anyway. Before bothering to rise, Aoife closes her eyes and consults the slacker in her subconscious. No response. Unwillingly, she stands to her feet. She waits, hoping for an answer, but the knocking keeps coming. A lurch, and she's at her desk, top drawer, where she keeps her medication. A handful of scrunched scrap paper, torn from early 30s novels, which had outlived their rereadability, but worked quite well to soothe those most antisocial nerves. The audacious cretin knocking at her door, which, for posterity, had been carved from a piece of the sonnet and was blessed to be mostly soundproof, turned out to be a shrunken old hag, dressed head to toe in filthy grey rags, like caked in actual filth, as though she'd been buried twice today. Aoife didn't much like the witches, not at the moment, and she could smell one a mile away. She hadn't much liked the witches for, say, 8 years now. This one exuded signs of witchhood, like she'd dressed as one for Halloween. Not only was she covered in shit and wearing a stupid hat, But Aoife could see that she was ballpark 102 years older than her, and she was babbling in Old French. A scholar of the occult, and ageless herself, the stained detective knew well enough that people-shaped people haven't really been immortality candidates for that long. All the saints were dead, so if you were older than 200, and you could usually tell, because Ole only does so much, then you were either a descendant of the first witches, or you were a Cambion, like Aoife. That was her designated title of species, acknowledged only by the witches. Aoife considered herself undead as a synonym for immortal. Held within her static flesh and bone were two souls bound as one, her dull mortal self and her remnant, a being which apparently represented some lost godhood. Been there, done that. They called it the natural way of things, which, well, she believed on some level because it worked in her favor. That said, her relationship with the parasite Nibirius had suffered a fissure or two in recent history, but the baseline survived. Nibirius offered her power and knowledge, abilities untold, and Aoife offered a solid footing on the stationary plate for as long as she stood. Abilities untold. Quite the phrase to use considering the nature of her remnant's physical influence on her. For through Aoife's inquisitive nature, Nibirius manifested a desire to consume living knowledge. By imbibing the flesh or fluids of another living creature, the stained detective could review every event of the bequeather's entire lifespan. The duration of this ability was difficult for even Nibirius to quantify, but let's say a single drop of blood might cover one's birth through to month 14. Blindfolded, she could chow down on, say, 100 grams of man mince and solve a whodunit in a matter of minutes. It never came in order, see. Truth be told, she'd often burn through a pint or two just finding where she needed to be, and folks were rarely such keen patrons. Beneath the calloused skin of her index finger, the stained detective kept a scalpel blade for such occasions. Perhaps, with her remnant's help, she might get a hearty scan in and hear a name or something useful like that. By the time she'd even considered nicking the woman's already bandaged skin, Aoife found herself serving afternoon tea to her guest. "Sugar?" she asked, entirely without meaning to say anything quite so pleasant. "Listen, can you stand yourself up, please, witch? I could do with a hello. Identify yourself, maybe. Tell me a secret. Anything will do, you know?" Of course, the crone did no such thing. She didn't even lift her tight veil of robes and wraps which doubled, no, tripled her actual size. Swaddled in them like a particularly resilient mummy or a 1,000-year-old baby. God, it was old cloth. Frayed edges, moth-chewed corners. Older than Aoife, certainly. She sat herself down on the guest settee to perhaps enforce a little eye contact, though she had difficulty locating the appropriate smears of shadow. Seeking stillness in the void, she found swarming motion. There was no hint that she might recognize the sullen cow, but the assumption that she ought to know her name right off the bat sent a prick up her spine. No amount of tutting, finger-clicking, or leg fidgeting brought a relevant legend to mind. There was a slight murmuring in the back of her head, though she put that down to the sound of Nibirius's disappointment. The aforementioned souring of their intangible connection had been brought on initially by the slow degradation of Aoife Sheridan's 234-year-old brain. There was no physical damage, nothing of the sort. She couldn't sustain any lasting damage because her body was in stasis. A quick look-see at the GP would chart Aoife's health as pretty good for a 25-year-old, because that's when she turned. But, as it happens, if you dedicate your entire unending life to study, you're eventually gonna run out of space up there. Her mental health was shot, so she was always up and down. She found herself misplacing solemn artifacts and biro pens throughout these hallowed halls, and she was, for the most part, generally losing her marbles. In a few decades, she hypothesized, she'd be as mad as the old bat in her nice, lovely leather recliner. "Have we met?" she asked. "Are you looking for a detective? I'm currently on leave, really, specially for your kind. Or is this the world's slowest burglary?" To the detective's surprise, the old crone spoke. Quite the opposite. Slow words trickled out like smoke vapor, crawling across the carpet and then up into Aoife's metaphorically and not so pointed ears. She didn't speak very much Old French, bar the archive's required reading, but apparently that didn't much matter. Instinct still begged her to leap over, grab the woman by the loose-fit bandages she'd wrapped herself in, and just find out what the hell was going on. She thought better of herself, and instead took what was being offered, a small rose gold ring. It was warm to the touch, certainly above body temperature. Nice. Very pretty, grumbled the strange detective, looking it over once or twice. It radiated wearability. A perfect circle, like it had been machined only 15 minutes ago and delivered specifically for Aoife's personal use. She was, of course, forbidden from wearing it. Some kind of artifact, is it? Beneath her veil, the crone nodded. It is now. The old bat took to her tea with terrific haste, as though she held the world record for most liquid absorbed by rags in 2.5 seconds, and was intent on keeping it. Irritating. It clearly came from Aoife's personal stash of vintage Narcissus, because she remembered pouring it for her, though she didn't remember pouring it for her. Without so much as a swallowing sound, another was requested, to which Aoife obliged by offering her own untouched mug. It was cold now, anyway. Between vicious sips, the old crone declared this ring to be a fragment of calamity itself, and with that, another artifact of Nick's entered Aoife Sheridan's life. She nearly dropped it, having almost stopped believing the stories were true. The suspicious radiation which she felt canoodling her palm was, in fact, the spiritual residue of the embellisher himself. How tantalizing. She'd seen one before, of course, but that must have been hundreds of years ago. Way, way before she'd been tenured with the archive. 1826? Aoife had stood beside the famed Kronos Rani of the Fifth as she sealed the heart of Sinis Nix and hid it away for all time. Obviously, you can't take everything the witches say as hard fact. Aoife knew firsthand that the embellisher had a tendency to bend the truth here and there, but the artifacts themselves had some stellar power behind them. 5 in pride, 6 in greed, recited the crone. In truth, Sinis Nix had only gifted their crown, eye, maw, heart, and cestus, which was clearly not enough, because from what was left over, the witches crafted 6 traditional magic bands, all sealed away, she continued, until today. Answer the phone. Aoife's cell phone had not rung yet, but it would shortly thereafter, formally confirming the detective's suspicion. Clairvoyance was not a common trait in witches, bar the stories. It was a specific skill set, and a rare one at that. Kronos, the magic of classical mechanics. Rare to meet a witch of your caliber, she told the crone as she lifted the phone to her ear. Hello, who is it? Speak up, I haven't got all day. Her pointed tone was a familiar one to the voice at the other end, as, consistent in her quirks, the stained detective never checked her caller ID. She was old, mostly, and anxious. And there were certainly people she didn't want to be talking to whom she would certainly have to answer. And that fact blew bubbles up her ass. So she kept her index finger over the middle of the screen to maintain an element of surprise on herself. A similarly sharp set of sounds stab out from the speaker. Don't start, it warned. It, of course, being the bitch witch supreme, former Pallas Victoria. Archwitch now, apparently. Those who can't do, don't you dare, she repeated. She would, though, because it was then Pallas Victoria's deciding vote that cast Aoife off Nomis Gramercy Isle in the first place, back in 2008, choosing to sack her from the school's board of artificers and essentially barring her from any and all magical investigation. Piece it together, and you can probably figure out that it's all been downhill from there, really. If only, she'd said, because real crime was all too mortal. What is it this time, Vicky? She asked. Hath the devil come down to Georgia? I'll tell you one thing, she bit back. The vampires certainly didn't return. Do you have a minute to talk about our Lord and Saviour Sinis Nix? Aoife threatened to hang up, but also excused herself from the Time Witch for the time being. She deduced that much already, now secure in the knowledge that such confident command of forbidden magic could only mean she wouldn't go meddling and get lost in the sparsely furnished depths of Strangelove. In a display of excellent patience for a woman of her boundless age, the stained detective allowed this backstabbing, snake-faced, third nipple-having knobhead to explain herself before she tossed her phone out the window. She didn't have windows, though she wasn't confident she'd said that bit out loud. The former Pallas was already talking, but Aoife's brain had not yet stopped narrating. She was a few essential details into the conversation before she actually clocked back in, so she asked Naberius for a summary after the fact. In short, some miscreant had ransacked the archive, nicking the Codex Invocaverant right from under the Bellwatch's nose. Aoife Sheridan knew what all of those words meant and the implications henceforth. That is, the implications of this phone call. Not a single lick of contact in 8 years. Not a phone call, not an email, not a raven through the window. Not that she had windows, but oh, look, another magical book has gone missing. Better call our very good friend Strangelove. Well, the archive certainly wasn't going to get another drop of Aoife's sweat, that was for sure. With a huff and a tut, she finally hung up the phone, returning herself to the Time Witch. Going with due haste and a single question, witching open the door to her study and stomping all the way along. "Are you with them?" she barked, holding her hands up in an offensive manner. She'd not learned much of any palace magic herself during the years under the sweet, sweet protection of tenure, though that was mostly because she'd spent all the years swatting away pepper fairies and solving murders. She did, however, opt to take a class or two in Tartarus magic. See, in order for a witch to cast their magic, it first needed to be distilled through something, often anything. In extreme circumstances, Aoife had seen witches appropriate blood or salt, olive oil, even barbecue sauce once. Primarily, they utilize a pestled mineral known as ashbearer ink, likely derived from another part of Sinisnix. It was rare, good day rare. A witch only earned so much ashbearer ink over their lifetime because their lifespan was so damn long. As such, witches are asked to make a choice now and again to permanently add a spell to their arsenal. A magic circle tattoo, quick-fire conjuring at the snap of your fingers. Aoife was covered in them because she specifically sought ashbearer ink as payment for her often less than legal methodology. It was a tough sell for all 29 years of her service, but she could have done anything around Thanatos' Mercy of the Eighth. Here, Aoife had run into a problem. With her current loadout, she could tie herself to anything with an Ocnus rope. She could call upon the very remnants lurking in the filter, though she'd failed to keep in contact recently, and she could even bring small, inanimate objects to life for at least 45 seconds. But she couldn't, say, set the Time Witch on fire or conjure 1,000 spectral missiles to smite her foe. So the pose was unnecessary, to say the least. A vogue rendered further lame by the undressing crone. She'd derobed herself, whilst unobserved, and beneath like 700 shabby shawls, she stood a meager 5'1". Seemingly dragged from some ancient sarcophagus, she was indeed covered head to toe in bandages. Fabric grew increasingly yellow as you made it closer to her chest, where it crisscrossed over her crooked body, in which to say that the bindings around her arthritic shivering fingers had most recently been rewrapped. It was, suffice to say, impossible to identify any definitive ashbearer stickenboke. Cambian eyesight was historically fantastic, and even from 3 meters away, Aoife could count 16 layers of gauze. More? Here and there, she had tufts of hair sticking out, which ran the length of her body like translucent trickling, so that helped shape where the crone was beneath all of that. But tricky thing was, she had this whole letterbox thing going on where her eyes should have been. No amount of focusing or distance closing could define them. It was as though there was simply nothing beneath the bandages besides the visage of a woman bent into the shape of a lightning bolt. "You've not said anything, Time Witch," she said, nodding towards her still outstretched hands. "I'm warning you, these puppies can go off like the Fat Man, and I'm really not as patient as the stories say I am." And then, of course, she was sat back on her guest settee, where no fistfight would occur. Nothing says "I'm well aware" more than literally skipping over the conversation entirely, and she knew it, because Aoife could remember the old crone, at one point in the last 15 minutes, had said that she had heard what had happened with the vampires, and it was not the move she would have made in that particular situation. Rude, if anything, because she was probably pushing out more vital information, like the identity of the patron saint of celebrity, or the recipe for her famous slow-cooker chili. The Time Witch was still stood up at this particular junction, and she creaked with each waft of the draft. "It was no coincidence that I came to you, Aoife Sheridan." The crone paused for a moment, as though something in the far reaches of her gaze caught her fancy, but she didn't point it out. 190 years ago, You recovered the transmutation maleficium from the clutches of Thanatos Yuaku of the Third. It was here, in this very room, that you struck her down through a medium that you should not have been able to comprehend, let alone understand. And yet, you earned the right to call the Hall of Hans the Slender your domain. You bore witness as Kronos Rani of the Fifth sealed the heart of Sinisnix and all his mementos alike, and in return, she allotted you 2 days of reading time, did she not? Aoife nodded, not that the time which waited for a response. I am neither friend nor foe to the witches, though I share their blood. Think of me as an interested third party, Aoife Sheridan. Think of me as a fan of Strangelove's track record. Resistance was futile. Aoife would later sum it up as something like a primal twitch, the opposite of fight or flight, or noticing that all the dust in the room never seems to find the right place to settle down. No matter what Aoife said, eventually she'd have to say the right thing, though she might make her way across several different languages if she has her way. I give up, stop doing that, she said. Then her phone vibrated. If a robbery brought the Time Witch out of her grave, then maybe it was worth a look-see. Rebalance the scales of calamity and integrity, and I will offer you a similar privilege. Cut the crap, stop with the buzzwords, Aoife told her. I don't want to read your stupid book. I'm running out of space as it is, and I'm sure you're aware, but I couldn't actually read that big white book you keep talking about, so what good is this to me? There was another chorus of creaking as the old crone looked Aoife up and down and back up again several times. Probably hard to tell with no eye contact. I could solve that problem right now if I wanted to. Suspicion increased. Aoife hated a braggart. She'd already pestered Niberius as to the probability of actual, real-life mummies, but as always, the answer was, it's all real, one way or another, which was of little help literally and metaphorically. For your information, the illegibility of the transmutation maleficium has little to do with you, Aoife Sheridan. One must first decipher the Codex Invocaverant before seeking out further strength. The embellisher of calamity knows full well the limitations of the flesh. Perhaps, if you jog your memory, you may come to some conclusions. Check your phone. God, the old crone made it sound so preordained. The stained detective knew that fate was rarely so unwilling to change course, unless somebody else was in the driver's seat. On her phone, Aoife had received a picture message from the former Palace Victoria, which appeared to be some kind of torn paper note. A calling card from the scene of the crime, pulled right out of a child's ring-bound journal. Cheap pink paper, dotted with love hearts, and on it, in biro, the culprit had drawn a rabbit with a smiling face, rosy cheeks, and a sweet little witch hat. In cursive, the note read, BRB, X. Niberius offered no further guidance, so Aoife agreed to take on the case. A little expansion of the old memory might do the trick. Unfortunately, there was bugger all she could do with just a picture. Say, she began, and you're gonna have to bear with me on this, okay? Because I'm not totally sure on the limitations of this oh-so-indigo reality, and I know nothing about the wildly forbidden magic you're tossing about with here. But if I may hypothesize, could you do us both a favor and just reach into space-time and yoink this drawing out of the pocket of Palace Victoria? She asked. Of the 8th, that is. I don't know who's doing it now, come to think. Check your pockets, said the crone. We'd better get a move on. She's already quite mad. In quarantine from witchy antics, Aoife Sheridan had been dabbling in the much more exciting mortal world of venture capitalism. Most recently, with no big bad skeleton to tell her no, she'd acquired an entire franchise of 80s-themed coffee shops. She had this whole team of accountants, see, and government dogs will pay top dollar even to those who don't really want it. It was a reasonable investment because she'd been going to each one across the country, introducing herself as the new CEO and linking the back office door to Strangelove. The Flat White Duke Coffee Company would become an access network throughout the United Kingdom and further, as opposed to the loose assortment of doors to Scandinavia her home originally held. With that said, Aoife and the Time Witch made their way to a franchise in Hull, of all places, where the last nice witch occupied a houseboat. Rani had lived a rather long, rather eventful life, and, quite frankly, enough was enough. In her own self-inflicted exile, Rani now pacifistically floated within the confines of her residential mooring with her wife and familiars. Aoife Sheridan was quite happy to disturb this relative peace as long as it meant getting home and going back to sleep. Not that Aoife needed sleep. It mostly just passed days for her. Don't need magic for that kind of time travel. Speaking of, as the two arrived on the marina, the Time Witch was asked to remain shoreside. Rani didn't open the door. Her wife did. As luck would have it, Lucci Melba had lost an arm in the initial recovery of the transmutation maleficium and still blamed Aoife for it. A grudge lasting, nearly 200 years? Rude, to say the least. But no words were exchanged in polite company. A request from Rani that had also held its weight for 2 centuries. "I've not even seen a witch for nearly 8 years, Aoife began. But I'm pretty sure today I've spoken to, say, 4 former members of the Intrinsic Council?" Lucci nodded and closed the door. "I'd say so," she said. "For sure. She's wearing a dampener charm. Couldn't even smell what kind of magic she used." "Kronos, like the missus," Aoife explained, pointing her attention towards the missus, who was reclined on a built-in sofa. It was a cozy old boat, wood-burning stove and all. On the table front and center between plastic cushioned couches were several mid-session decks of cards. It appeared that, in every conceivable timeline, Rani was getting her ass kicked. Aoife continued with her brief explanation. Not that the fifth-in-line fixed point in time hadn't already witnessed the hot scoop herself. "You've got something for me, friend?" asked Rani, refusing to sit herself up like the forever kitten she'd adopted as a familiar. Relaxed, stress-free. The Kronos of the Fifth was as powerful as ever, and as she took the piece of paper from Aoife, she cast a spell under her breath. Bare-armed magic. No circle, nothing. That was the power of an intrinsic witch. Free-form access to the embellisher's calamity-driven stream of energy. "Erica Malleus," she said finally. "She stole the codex. She shouldn't be too difficult to find. I'll even write her address down for you, save you the Googling, friend." "Erica Malleus," repeated Lucci. "Little rascal. They should have locked her away when she was born." "Who?" insisted Aoife. Clearly, this Erica Malleus had a formidable reputation, but as far as Aoife could remember, she'd not come across that name before. If possible, Nibirius would have shaken their head. But they had neither a neck nor anything you could specifically call a head. Some punk student, she assumed, who'd been causing trouble with their innate gift. Far from it, though. Erica Malleus was not allowed to study at the school because she wasn't a witch. Lucci piped up. "It's not because she's not a witch. It's because she's unnatural." Rani rose, causing 2 of the decks to slide across the table, essentially nullifying all 5 results. "You shouldn't speak such guff, dear," she said. "Erica Malleus is a lost lamb, undeserving of her current situation. The council turned a blind eye to her birth, and now that her guardians have passed, that lost lamb's developed a bit of a rebellious streak. Witches, always stalking around the point. Answer," demanded Aoife. "Please answer the question. I don't want to be here all day. Clearly, you're in the middle of something plain and simple. Number 1 answer on the board. Erica Malleus is a homunculus," was the answer, and it came as quite a surprise. Aoife had been keeping an eye on the science since 1998, and nobody had even come close. Rarely did the Intrinsic Council simply sweep something under the rug like this. More often than not, cruelty overcame kindness. Calamity was aptly named indeed. Her parents, seemingly known criminals, birthed her in a Percy's magic ritual, and simply hid her amongst Sydney's northern beaches. Of course, you can't hide much from those who know all. So by all means, it was quite clear that the council chose not to acknowledge her existence until only 2 years ago, when her parents passed performing another similar ritual. Incredible magical aptitude from birth. Supposedly daffodils sprouted wherever she stepped. Aoife posed another question, one she knew to be stupid in nature, though that was very on-brand. "You can't just, say, reach into space-time and pull," Rani objected. You know that's not allowed, friend." With her thumb, Aoife pointed behind her towards the exit-bound staircase and, more generally, to the witch outside. "She bloody did it." "Well," Rani paused. "Well then, I presume the time police will be along any minute, Aoife. I expect you'll be leaving for Sydney ASAP. You could open up a portal to Heathrow at least." There was, for posterity, no evidence of any time police in the employ of Salem or any such entity in all of, well, time. It was an urban legend, like an old wives' tale, to stop stupid children from wandering into the woods. Only in this scenario, the stupid children could, with some practice, turn back time and erase the very concept of woods. With all that said, Aoife decided that it was time to make her move. She thanked her friend, she thanked her foe, and headed up the staircase towards the exit-bound door when, out of nowhere, she could taste nothing but sand. Wet sand, too. She fell out of the door, rather than stepped gracefully, as she'd like to imagine she did. It took a second for Aoife to gather her bearings, but as it appeared, either Rani or the Time Witch had enchanted the boat's way out in a similar manner to that of Strangelove. Now, she lay on a surprisingly cold and incredibly wet beach, most likely located, from the taste of it and also context clues, in the land down under. It was sometime in the nighttime when they arrived, because that's how the world worked. A wave washed over her, carrying the silver sheen of spread moonlight. Soaked her. Absolute nightmare. She certainly didn't know any hex of dryness or anything like that, and the old crone didn't feel like helping much. She was too busy, enjoying the view out across the ocean, or the Tasman Sea. It was one of the two. She wasn't quite sure. It was beautiful, shimmering, but not so much distracting. Then again, all of them, and this is not a presumption or a racist remark, but every single goddamn witch loves a good full moon. Waves lapped again, with no consideration for splash radius, and Aoife was beginning to take on more water than she comically deserved. On approaching the Time Witch, Aoife noticed that she was stood on the water's surface, amongst the reflections, and, without permission, she appeared to be doing the very same. See, Thomas and Elizabeth Malleus obviously lived in their own exile too. Otherwise, where would they have conducted their spooky experiments? And as lairs tend to be, it sat in the ocean somewhere uncharted, presumed to be unassuming. Oceans, being large, made for fantastic getaways, especially when you could materialize an island with relative ease. It was a brisk half-hour straight-out walk from the absolute center of Avalon Beach to what honestly appeared to be an enormous lightning rod stuck smack dab in the middle of nowhere waters. Evidently rust-proof sheet metal squares created a still cylinder, likely embedded in the Earth's bedrock crust. A trio of ringed prongs decorated the top, and about a third down from there, a single circular porthole. It was ballpark 312 feet in length, and tapered off at the bottom as though ending in a needlepoint. Bare otherwise on all sides, the old crone had to summon a ladder for them to reach the only possible entrance. Boy, did that feel risky. Top of the ladder, with shuddering winds tugging at her smoking jacket, and both hands pressed firm against the weathered alloy for balance. Too high. The stained detective knew that it was a magic ladder, so she wasn't going anywhere, and even if she did, she knew a fall from here couldn't kill her off. But that certainly didn't mean that Aoife Sheridan wasn't shitting herself. The Time Witch hadn't followed any further than the righteous waves. She'd stand guard at the ladder in case somebody else came paddling by. So there was Aoife, alone at the teetering top of the ladder, unsure of how to proceed. It was at this point, swaying 208 feet in the air, that she realized she was no longer so much investigating anything, but being led from place to place by somebody who knew what was going to happen at each location. Frankly, it was feeling more and more like a fool me twice situation. Glancing down, the old crone was waving up like a day tripper at a fun fair. Somehow, she even had a hot cup of tea. Even from this height, Aoife could tell she was probably smiling. She knew, obviously, that Aoife was now wondering why she'd even been brought into this mess. For one, why was it so easy to pocket that ring? So easy, she'd not even thought about it, actually. Had the dust not settled there either? Third party. Enough about her for now. This Aoife Malleus character was sure to be fascinating. Aoife only hoped that she'd get the drop on her and have, at the very least, an interesting conversation. The mechanism in front of her seemed simple enough, because it had to be. There were literally no other options. No hinge, no bolts anywhere, extruding only an inch or two out from the wind-slapped metal surface. This porthole wasn't exactly a window into Erica's den, and it was dusty as all hell on the outside. It needed a wipe down. She didn't even want to put her face on it, and Aoife Sheridan was a crust punk queen in some circles. Cycling through options, hawking a loogie would probably get a fair bit of grease off. Nibirius couldn't confirm any biological differences in a Cambian saliva, despite the lack of its necessity, but Aoife was certain that she could taste copper at all times. She spat, though it disappeared. She spat again, and it disappeared. So she spat. Then it was a mouthful of shag carpet and the warmth of an old coal fireplace. An angular, misshapen adult man pointed a lone finger at the detective from atop a pale kitchen table. Must have clambered up in some haste, as he'd spilled an entire carton of semi-skimmed, which lay soaking into the fabric about 2 meters ballpark from Aoife's recently bonked head. Legs shoulder-width apart and bent at the knees, he may as well have had an exclamation point above his head. His head? One look at the man and, "Where the hell am I?" she said by accident. What a bloody day. First Hull, then New South Wales, and now, well, it appeared to be some kind of bungalow in the boonies. Wood cabin interior, open plan, candle lit, lavender scented, decorated with dotted oddities like trinket skulls, ornate vases, art and jewelry. You know, the telltale signs of a cat burglar. "Well," said the muffled detective, "an answer would be nice. I've been falling through doors all day and I'm starting to feel travel sick." Aoife rose to her feet slowly to avoid any unnecessary confrontation, and rose to the occasion by considering the shapeshifter an ally. It was difficult to maintain eye contact, but that was due to the multitude of distracting factors, and not only because the gentleman wasn't quite right. He was ballpark 7 foot and 5 inches tall. He had a milk mustache as well. Also, his eyes were too high up, and his chin appeared to still be bubbling. At his feet, splintered wood, wilting shoots, and a dusty old tome, the book she was looking for. His feet remained rooted, firmly, still, unlike his vibrating upper half, almost purposely proving Aoife's theory. Aoife Malleus. It was all in the name, honestly. "What are you doing in my house?" he yelled in the voice of a little girl, before quickly covering his own mouth. "It's alright, kiddo," said Aoife. "I'm a bit of a thief myself. Sometimes, though, things need to go back. I'm willing to make a trade, if you're interested." With flourish, Aoife revealed her impending prize. "An artifact of Nyx," she said. "Don't know what it does. Do you want it? I mean, you've already read the book, right? Or I guess I don't mind waiting here until you're done with it." The Switch Witch mulled over from above, but soon decided his poised position was unfit for hard thought. On more solid footing, his eyes seemed to be bobbing about the skin of his face in a manner most unnatural. He takes the book in hand and approaches in vain. They're lavender sprouts, not daffodils, beneath Erica's feet. It was, by all means, the least subtle surprise attack Aoife had ever come under. Telling. Like amateur hour slapstick, he swung only one of his lopsided arms with each stride forwards, holding the other outstretched to grasp the ring, a motion that Aoife would return in kind, having already pocketed the crone's prize. With intent to, at least sample, the shapeshifter's wacky ride of a lifespan, Aoife grasped the offending limb with all her strength and... an explosion. Aoife was sent flying backwards into the wall, then doubly smacked by the ensuing shockwave. Not enough to knock her dead, but judging by the visage of bone and red matter in lieu of a right arm, Aoife estimated she'd be down for about 15 minutes. It's like she'd lined her skin with claymores. A colossal release of magical energy had ripped her and the shapeshifter apart by force. How unstable. Incredible that the council would simply turn away from somebody so built to run amok. Aoife Malleus looked the part now, encompassed by swarming lights of October orange and ube violet, stood 4'8" off the ground, atop overgrown but dying shrubbery. Out of nowhere, she'd donned a striped poncho and a big stupid hat atop plush, blooming Pomeranian hair. 2-pence piece copper wisped out at split ends, fading to scrap paper grey. Sparks whip crack around her, radiating such intimidating strength that her perspiration turns to steam. Witches tend to remain pretty spry looking for the first few hundred years, but this little girl must have been, ballpark, 14, 16 actual years old, and her skin was littered with imperfect magic circles done in permanent marker. Sure, Aoife was a little in shock, but they were totally illegible and certainly made up. They wouldn't work, normally, but the young witch took stance to launch a front-on attack. In a contest of all-out strength, Aoife would surely fall short. No magic in her repertoire could match up to the heights of power-given form, and there was nothing suitable on hand to summon, say, Salios or Agaris onto her plane. A swift retreat, then regroup with the Time Witch. Surely this was also supposed to happen, right? Slip up the wall backwards and wriggle through the porthole. Oof, that'd be a trip. At what height does water become concrete? 200 feet? 250? How about face first? In that case, best to make sure the crone's ring is safe. Her remaining flash hand snakes into her pocket, and it simply slips on. One day, Aoife Sheridan would leave her home without sustaining some sort of mortal wound, or, at the very least, limit herself to one a day. The crone's band burned with all the fire of Sinus Nix himself, searing his image into her mind. She seemed to fall into the pain. It sears into her skin, then deeper still when the flesh gives way to bone. Briefly, her mind feels so full that it might actually split at the seams and expand endlessly across the planet, like an intellectual smoke scourge or a supervolcanic eruption of molten grey matter. Mass extinction by a simple wealth of knowledge. It was every single thing that Aoife Sheridan had ever heard, read, thought, seen, or spoken in all 231 years, 6 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days of her life that she'd lived. Not a single tidbit was lost to the annals of her ancient mind. She could recall even the lone utterings of Nibirius, and their musings on the structure of reality itself. It only hurt for a few moments, though it passed like backyard surgery. It would be sore for a while, but not as sore as the exposed and still reforming bone claw on her other arm. It was permanently welded to her now, the ring. No sense in hiding that from the old crone. Erica was long gone. While Aoife was out cold, she'd made her getaway by blowing a hole in the faux wood wall of the needlepoint den. She could only hope that Victoria did show up now. Fortunately, she'd kept her phone switched on and today's location services were impeccable. She'd be found in a flash, she figured. But it wasn't like Aoife was fading away or anything. In fact, she felt better than ever. Fresh in head and body, as though cobwebs throughout had been thoroughly dusted and all cogs and whirs had been greased to factory quality. It was as though her soul had been plucked from the old, tired and stupid cadaver of Aoife Sheridan and slapped into a supercomputer designed for her own specificities. That, and Aoife felt very much more in contact with Nibirius, whom she could see so clearly looming in the back of her head. Now, the spectral devil had nothing to complain about, besides an impending request to explain what the hell just happened. It would take a moment to get used to, she figured, what with the dizziness she felt standing to her feet. All in all, she wasn't in too bad a shape. Her skeleton had finally finished regenerating, though it would take exactly 27 more minutes to heal completely, 21 for the muscular and vascular systems, and 6 for the skin and hair to come back. Fortunately, her Ashbearer ink would also reform. Magic, innit? Where now? Aoife had expected the old crone to at least try to climb up and see if she was still breathing, but as she peeped her head out of the porthole, it was Archwitch Victoria's mug that Aoife met with a scowl. She was floating, so why couldn't the Time Witch? Oh, because she was gone, probably followed on foot. She was nimble, evidently age still meant nothing to her. Aoife wriggled herself further out of the needlepoint den, the porthole portal cutting her off just above the waist. Ample room to examine the Archwitch. Naturally negating the currents of the sky, she stood totally still. Not even her cloak followed the breeze. her military getup starched stiff beneath her big, stupid hat. The former soldier of fortune wore a grimace. The Arkwitch had no time for words, and jetted off to her next destination. Preparation, as Aoife recalled, is rightly 2/3 of any venture, and so she'd already done the busy work of tying herself to Victoria with an Ocnus rope, which she'd summoned with a few reams of slack. Soon, it pulled her out of Erica's illusory cottage and into the vast open airspace by the unadulterated strength of the killer queen of Salem's spite herself. Not that Victoria didn't notice. In fact, she yelled something fairly obscene and threatened to drown Aoife where she hung. It was only the sudden sight of something enormous that caused her to delay the culpable homicide of the stained detective. At first, the distance between them made it appear to be a smokestack straight out piercing heaven, or a streak of daylight outpacing its rival. Then, as if clearing the exhale, one of 4 thick smouldering arms swept off the smog. Amidst it stood Erica Malleus in a form unimaginable, having just met her. Thick stone skin, stricken with cracks and fissures, hardly containing the screaming inferno inside. Cylindrical head, Goliath human lips. It could only have been an aspect of Sinis Nix himself. Erica had been overwhelmed by the Codex. Its imperceptible texts and psychic subliminal messaging found a welcome home in her excusably malleable molecules, and the swathing robes of corruptible energies that made her her made him sweat with anticipation. And as always, that's when it all clicked into place. At least, some motivations made a little more sense. The old crone, she was still standing on the water's crest. Her bandages were beginning to unravel, but she showed no sign of fatigue. Had they been in combat this whole time? A certain scent of desperation sort of clung to the air, as though Erica felt she'd been forced into a corner. Perhaps, if Aoife had not blown her own hand off then severely burnt the other one, she might have felt a tad more relaxed about the whole thing. The Time Witch did what she did best, twisting the fabric of reality in such a way as to temporarily revert the effects of rapid global warming, turning back the clock far further back than any present being may have witnessed. Calling from the depths below, ancient volcanic sediment, a geokinetic island, a viewing platform for Aoife and her steed. The two landed with immediate haste. Hovering the both of them had knocked the wind out of Victoria, but it was clear that her input would have been unnecessary regardless. She looked quite shocked when she muttered, "That's a blatant violation of the Gramercy Sacrament," which, in fairness, it was, but it was to be assumed that this particular witch might have been above such guidelines, as it were. They watched on agape, as all her gauze fell unwrapped, as the landmass shuddered still, in full stride against an aspect of Nyx. The silver-haired short-ass spared zero theatrics. With a snap of her fingers, her scorch-scarred skin was encircled by wisps of indigo that sparked and cracked around her, like she'd been staked to a November 5th bonfire. You'd hardly think she could walk amongst the living, let alone stand so strong in the face of certain defeat, with such vast amounts of previously sustained damage. Burns so deep they'd tempered her physical form, causing several thick patches of carbonized flesh to develop in areas where her skin was thinner, around the eyes, across the lips, up the back of her hands and between her fingers, deep as coal, harder than diamond. She too bore the visage of the embellisher's form, Chronos Liberté, of the first, Calamity's second wind, and the founder of witchcraft, had returned to correct the mislaid course of a seemingly distracted intrinsic council by force, if necessary. As all the stories had told, even those from the tongue of Nibirius, the preordained goal of which kind was, of course, to craft a vessel for Belphegor's rise, and, well, there had been 9 sets of intrinsic witches and very little progress. This form, however, she deemed unacceptable. Erica wasn't willing or able to stomach the might of Sinis Nix, and had thus been blinded to her own actions. Fists flew like fighter jets towards Liberté, but refused to connect, each one vanquished by a movement unseen. The aspect roared, sending a catastrophic seismic wave out towards the 4 corners of the map, a frequency that burst both of Aoife's eardrums and tore the Arkwitch's stupid hat right off. Through persistent ringing, the stained detective watched on as the aspect advanced, dragging itself through miles of ocean trenches. Teetering off balance, it bore teeth, a historical first. Not even the first witches documented seeing a tongue. Liberté made no sudden movements besides turning to face Aoife and waving. When the aspect finally collided wastwards with the Time Witch's landmass, she turned her back to her foe and wiped the slate clean. To put it briefly, it had all been done without having to be done in the first place. Erica lay flat out atop the rock face, dozing with no visible injuries. She'd simply been restored to a previous version of herself, plucked out of a recent time frame, likely sometime before she'd had the chance to read the book. Another clear violation of the Gramercy Sacrament. Kronos Liberté of the First turns to dust before her eyes, erased from her position as a fixed point in time. "Time police," declared Aoife, though mostly to test if her ears had healed up yet. "You've got to be fucking kidding me," said Victoria, though certainly unironically. She couldn't be blamed. It did very much appear that Kronos Rani's much-rumoured time police did exist, and she'd been holding on to that tale since she served in the Fifth Council. Of course, it was just as likely that the original witch had finally exhausted her own personal supply of magic. In the end, all formerly intrinsic witches are also formerly immortal. As if to prove a point against ever using the phrase time police again, Aoife collected one of Liberté's bandages and wrapped it around the wrist of her ring-bearing arm. A memento which, if thoroughly inspected, might turn out to be worth boiling like a witchy stock. It'd be interesting to find out how much she really knew, said Victoria, from afar. Best to make a move on Erica, actually. Victoria clearly hadn't yet clocked that the codex would be somewhere on her person. Being careful not to touch the highly volatile Claymore child, Aoife retrieved the tome with her most recently acquired hand. It seemed to be damp and smelled slightly of milk. It also appeared to emit a vapour of some manner, though Naberius seemed certain that the embellisher, Belphegor, could not take refuge in an occupied host. Before Aoife could even open it, Victoria's hand graced her shoulder. Fully prepared to judo throw the bitch witch supreme straight into the South Pacific, Aoife's muscles tightened up. "What's your next move, Vicky? Where do you go from here?" No movement in her shaggy blonde hair, no billow in her cloak. The Archwitch was many things, but quick to pass true judgment she was not. In her military fatigues and combat boots, even decades after her service, Victoria had a reputation that even the last living angels would herald. Here, on an island warring with time, having witnessed the prime monarch of witchcraft do battle with the progenitor of magic itself, without spilling a drop of either's blood, Archwitch Victoria knew exactly what her next move was going to be. Though, to be fair, she'd known from the moment she'd left the archive. It was clear now to both parties that Kronos Liberté had assisted Erica Malleus in the robbery of the Codex Invocaverant. Certain aspects, however, remained unavailable to the stained detective. The initial explosion had been caused by Erica's poor control over her own magic. That was her arrival. Her departure came much swifter, and with an unprecedented cleanup. When Victoria arrived on the scene, Kronos Juliet of the Ninth informed quite promptly that she hadn't reverted the damage. Somebody else had. Stunk of Kronos magic, though. You can only hide so much from the personification of it. Liberté appeared again to pick Victoria's pocket, during which she'd spoken to her in Old French. Very little context, but the Archwitch was told flat out who the culprit would be and exactly what the Ninth Council was hiding. Erica Malleus, an embodiment of Percy's magic. A being of pure calamity. It was exactly what the Council should have been looking for, but instead, they'd shirked their responsibilities and left her for dead. According to Liberté, Erica could wake the artifacts of Nyx by simply being near them, something about frequency and resonation. To be honest, a lot of this was coming secondhand from somebody that only really knew what was going on because she'd once been inhabited by a divinely unending source of magic, and not because she'd researched the phenomenon. Witches are, by all means, creatures of tall tales. All in all, she needed the Codex because she needed to read the Transmutation Maleficium, because she wanted to find all of them, and she wanted to do it efficiently. The Band of Wits, which now resided on the finger of a Cambion, was the purest evidence of this. Cat burglar, Erica couldn't help herself. She'd found one all by herself. She didn't even need help to get into the archive. Liberté simply felt it happening and reacted as one might by pinching back the ring, but, letting the little scamp leave with the book. Attention-seeking allowed. With a witch willing to cast away her own right to exist, there was never any risk that Erica might run wild. A controlled experiment, the results of which would come upon their return. Victoria lifted the child up with a flick of the wrist, and she floated in place. Now, the codex has been recovered. The kid's gonna come with me, said the Archwitch, finally acting like a teacher. Proper training. That'll sort her out. Can't be left to fend for herself, not like this. Bet she's gonna be a nightmare when she wakes up. I'll never hear the end of it. Aoife confirmed. Well, that's probably what the old crone was trying to say. Well, that and, hey, homunculus equal good. Sure, said the Archwitch, summoning a portal before their eyes. Various shades of indigo squirmed free from thin air, crackle spark, then twist. In the eye of this storm fizzled a window, leading to the grand gates leading to the Our Lady of Palace School of Witchcraft. Come along, Aoife. I can permit you the 2 allotted days reading time you were offered. I will see the Kronos' will through to the end. I cannot, however, permit you to read it anywhere other than deep within the Archives library. If you wish to return yourself to studies of magic, you will do so on my terms. And begrudgingly, the Cambion stepped in through the portal to where the witches lived, casting one last glance at the fullest moon she'd ever seen.
You have been listening to the Switch Witch Script Pinch, an episode of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, written and directed by Jake Lucy. This production is copyright 2020 by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency and is intended for enjoyment purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If you would like to support the show, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/sbda. Please visit us on the web at sleepybones.agency for more surreal stories.